Long Voyage Back, Part 3, Water, page 219. Free! Except for the threat of radioactive fallout, of storms, of pirates, of their overloaded trimaran breaking apart, of death, thirst or starvation or disease, of mutiny, of the antagonism that the rest of the world now felt for the white people of America and Russia, both of whom they blamed for the war. Those aboard the Vagabond were free to do as they pleased. They sailed south. The war sailed with them, although they increased their distance from the coast as they moved south and the threat of fallout receded. The bodies of at least two of their crewmen, Frank, Ollie, and possibly others, had already absorbed the poison. Frank looked much more haggard than anyone else, had lost 10 pounds, and was sick again after a 3-day remission. Ollie was better but still feeling poorly. Even Neil still felt unaccountably nauseous once or twice. Nevertheless, at sea, after a whole day of adjusting, sleeping accommodations, meal times and rations, they settled into a routine. Their watches remained the same, except that Katia sometimes spelled Lisa and shared a watch with Jim. Macklin and Tony berthed together in the forespeak. Katia was in with Jean, and Ollie slept either in Neil's cabin or on the dinette settee. Tony, in his bluff, self-confident way, had made himself thoroughly at home again, although he spoke loudly the first day or two about being forced to let his country down, after they heard a report about heavy radioactivity over Morehead City and the mass evacuations of everyone who could move. He didn't raise the subject again. He flirted with both Jean and Katia, helped them in the galley more than any of the other men, and turned out to be an excellent cook, especially good with fish, which was their principal food. He was also, Neil admitted to himself, the best all-round sailor on his crew. Katia and Jean got along well together, and although Katia wasn't a cook, she let Jean, Lisa and Tony instruct her. She was, as she had advertised, a good sailor and tough. She usually volunteered to help with the sail changes on any watch when she was awake. When Tony and Macklin began to come on to her, she handled each of them in his own style. With Tony, she was casual and playful. With Macklin, quiet and direct. Neil never knew precisely what passed between her and Macklin their second evening at sea, but he saw him speak to her in the side cockpit with a tight smile, saw her flush and speak to him angrily. He sneered and said something back, and wandered quietly away. If Katia was as good at fucking, she apparently was in no hurry to prove it, at least with Macklin. Macklin himself rarely said or did anything to draw attention to himself. He blended in. On land he had stolen a case of canned fruit, a carton of cigarettes, and 5 six-packs of beer. Although the fruit was relegated to emergency rations, they worked their way through the beer at a rate of 2 a day, dividing it up and sipping at it as if it were fine champagne. When asked where he had gotten these items, he simply shrugged and said he had stumbled across them in some guy's cellar. The destination was the West Indies, initially Puerto Rico, but with the southeast wind forcing them to sail directly south, by the end of the 3rd day Neil felt they were already so close to the Bahamas that they should make a landfall on the great Abaco Island. There they might barter for more food and water, even if they found the right conditions, try to settle. However, Radio Nassau reported debilitating food shortages throughout the islands, and Americans were not welcome. If their principal food was fish, they might as well remain at sea. Fishing was, in fact, the focus of every morning and evening's activity. They had 2 ocean rods and reels with good line, but only 5 lures, one of which they lost on the 2nd day. At dawn and dusk they usually trolled with both rigs, one from each cockpit. The rods were usually jammed into a place with a strong drag on the reels so that no one had to sit and hold them all the time. When a fish was hooked, the helmsman would bring the boat up into the wind to slow it down, and someone would stand by with both a gaff and a large net, while the other man on watch duty, who was responsible for the rods, would begin to reel in the hooked fish. Because this type of fishing was new to most of them, and because ultimately their lives depended on it, bringing in a fish was a major community event. They caught 2 bluefish their first evening, a 20-pound tuna the next dawn, 2 dolphins and a tuna at dusk. Then inexplicably lost 2 hooked fish and a second lure at dawn the next day. The 3rd evening, however, they recouped their losses with another dolphin and a barracuda. Neil was still wearing his arm in a sling after cracking his elbow on the moon chaser and couldn't help with the fishing. But it interested him to watch the different styles of bringing in and gaffing the fish his crew had evolved. When Frank was in charge of the gaffing, there was shouting and confusion and irritability before Frank could get the man controlling the rod and reel to position the fish properly for gaffing. Once the fish was flopping around in the cockpit, there was always a delay and more shouting before Frank, looking pained, would knife the fish out of its misery. When Ollie was in charge, everything proceeded as quietly as a silent movie, the only sound being Ollie's soft crooning to the fish. Ollie never told the man with the rod or the helmsman what to do. But by talking to the fish, "Come on in a little closer, fella. My back hurts, so I don't like leaning down none," the man with the rod would know exactly what to do. When he gaffed the fish, Ollie would say something like, "Up you go, sonny, easy does it," as if the fish wanted to come aboard, and all of them were involved in a cooperative enterprise. Then, after the fish was flopping on the deck, Ollie would take a minute to praise the fish to all the onlookers. "Look at those colours, will you? I ain't seen anything as pretty as that since my second wife bought herself that new dress," or "Now isn't that a big fella? Must weigh 25 pounds and not an ounce of fat. Bet he was an Olympic champ down below." When Ollie killed, he always began talking to the fish again. "Okay, big fella, afraid we got to quiet you down. I gave you time for your prayers, but if you got anything else you want to say, you better say it now." The fish would flop violently in response to this, or once, so everyone agreed, made some distinct grunting sounds, and then Ollie, with one neat slice, would quiet the fish forever. "Don't you look beautiful?" Ollie would conclude. "Just hope I look half as good when the big fisherman hauls me in and lays me out. I'm damn sure I won't taste as good." Conrad Macklin, on the other hand, gaffed and killed a fish with a fierce scowl, as if he was involved in a life-or-death combat with a lifelong enemy. When Jean participated in the fishing, Neil found himself focusing more attention on her than on the fish. Her glistening dark skin and full-life body distracted him considerably from the problem of boarding the fish, especially as she wrestled with the rod and reel, or stuck her behind in the air to lean down to gaff a fish, clad as she usually was only in shorts and a bikini top. She and Katia seemed to have the same effect on Tony, Macklin, and Frank. Lisa's budding body, perhaps because of her shy dignity, was less observed, except by Jim. They were adapting to a world of scarcity. Neil had decreed that their remaining 2 gallons of diesel fuel could only be used to charge the 3 batteries. Oil was unavailable everywhere now except to the military. To avoid having to charge the batteries any more than necessary, Neil used them solely for the shortwave radio. For illumination they used kerosene lamps and, if necessary, flashlights. They had only 4 gallons of kerosene, and that too might never again be easy to obtain. The 24 candles aboard Neil stored as a light of last resort. Even matches were scarce. Fortunately, no one smoked except Jim, who smoked marijuana and was abstaining, and Macklin, whose cigarettes had been confiscated by Neil to use in the West Indies as barter. But the bleakness of the land world and of shortages Neil and Frank and Ollie kept to themselves. For all of them the sea represented a haven, a relief from the terrors and suffering they had experienced on land, and Neil wanted to try and keep it that way. For the first time there began to be casual joking amongst them that had been missing before. On the second afternoon, Neil had overheard Captain Ollie teasing Frank about Vagabond. "Yep," Captain Ollie was saying, "you got a good boat here, Frank. All you got to do is take off those 2 side boats you got and unstep the masts and put a bowsprit on her and paint her black, and she'd be right pretty. Might not even have to paint her." Frank laughed as he sat down in the wheelhouse with a small cup containing his daily ration of beer. "Thanks," he said to Ollie, who was at the helm with his own cup. "Don't be embarrassed your boat don't look like a boat," Ollie went on. "Brazen it out. Pretend you've got yourself a beginner's boat. You know, a 3-reeler so you won't tip over." Frank laughed again, and Neil realised it was the first time since the war had begun that he had laughed. "I tell people I got a special 3 for the price of 1 deal that I couldn't pass up," Frank said. "Yep, good story, good story. Got to tell them something, that's for sure, so they won't know you're nuts," Captain Ollie concluded. While Neil assumed responsibility for the sailing of the ship, Jean began to assume responsibility for the way they interacted with each other. At dinner the second day out, she suggested that every evening meal they observe a half-minute of silence before eating, and if anyone wanted to offer thanks for the food or for life, he or she might. Jean usually spoke, occasionally mentioning some specific individual she wanted to acknowledge. Often Katia or Jim or Frank would also add a brief word. more rarely Tony or Neil. That night too she embraced and kissed each of the others who were still topside before she went below to her berth. Although all she said was good night in the person's name, Neil could see the physical contact breaking through the isolation each of them tended to feel. Even Conrad Macklin flushed and looked pleased. Among the men, at Jean's insistence, there were more "good job Frank" and "thanks Jim" and "that's good Tony," where before there had either been cold correctness or nothing. Captain Ollie had the most trouble adapting to the more affectionate routine that Jean kept urging upon them. When Neil relieved him at the helm at the change of watch and said, "Nice job, Ollie," he testily replied, "Can't expect me to run aground in 5,000 feet of water." When Jean gave him a good-night kiss the second night, he grimaced and grinned. "Wasn't much of a kiss. If you want to get laid, you got to do better than that." Jean looked surprised and then smiled. "Don't worry," she had said, her eyes flashing. "When I want to get laid, the man will know." Most of them found their meals repetitious and skimpy. They were rationing themselves severely on the last of their canned foods, and some remaining fruits and vegetables, and salting and drying some of their fish steaks for later. They were cooking in salt water, and had cut their freshwater intake to a quart per person per day. The 6 adults were experimenting with drinking a cup or 2 of seawater every day. To avoid unnecessary gloom, Neil became a censor. He permitted only Frank and Ollie to listen to the shortwave and transistor radios with him. The violent anti-white, anti-Americanism he was picking up from stations in the West Indies they kept to themselves. The probability of mass starvation within a month on many of the islands they did not mention. Officially they were sailing for a chain of islands that were still untouched by the war. In his heart, Neil knew that no place, and no one, and nothing would ever be untouched by this war. Shortwave and AM reports on the US mainland raised a new spectre on the 3rd day of sea. A summer flu that had seemed to be afflicting many people in the west and southwest had already caused an unusually high number of fatalities. One ham radio speculated that a biological warfare laboratory had been destroyed and that part of its stockpile of disease germs were responsible for the epidemic. In any case, it now seemed to be killing more people than fallout. Typhoid had also become a problem. Of the fighting itself there was little news. The superpowers were still technically at war, but now they were more like 2 exhausted and glassy-eyed fighters who had landed such devastating blows in the first round that they now seemed barely capable of standing up, much less hitting each other. Thus it seemed that each day the ramifications and elaborations of the world disaster spread a little further, like a spilled bottle of black ink slowly soaking along a paper towel. Cuba had been heavily bombed with conventional ordnance early in the war. When the Cubans tried to take the naval base at Guantanamo, the US had used a tactical nuclear weapon to destroy most of their enemy forces. Cuba's private air force and navy had allegedly been destroyed, but no effort made to invade the island. Guantanamo was being evacuated. Although nuclear explosions had destroyed the Panama Canal, Miami, Cape Canaveral, American forces in Central America and the oil refineries in Venezuela, the Caribbean area had been spared since the 3rd day of the war. Some rich Americans were flying to Puerto Rico, and this influx of the privileged was deeply resented. Despite the presence of the US Navy, which with the losses of its other Caribbean bases now had its largest facility outside San Juan, pirate attacks were reported against both private and commercial ships, both small and large. Food riots occurred on a regular basis in San Juan and smaller cities, although officially there was as yet no famine. It was to this island that Vagabond was supposedly heading, but in the new world they had all experienced over the last 10 days, no one aboard really expected anything. Neil set a course, they sailed on. In this new world the future was something that could only hurt or terrify or kill. To look beyond the next wave was dangerous. Neil set a course, they sailed on. To hope for more could only be done in whispers.